Welcome to my very first episode of Karen's Quilt Circle. As I read through my emails, messages, and comments, I receive so many questions that I just don't have enough expertise or knowledge of a specific type of quilting to answer. So I'm reaching out to those that do. Quilters that have put in the time and have found their niche. They're going to share their journey, their knowledge, and maybe a couple of mistakes they've made along the way. So grab a sewing project, your cup of tea, and sit back. I am so happy to start the series with Anita Zobens. She came into my life early in my quilting journey as she used to hold very successful workshops called the Thread Bar. She taught me so much about thread, needles, and gave me the confidence to play with that tension button on my sewing machine that we're all so afraid of. So without further ado, here's my interview with Anita. Thank you so much for showing up, Anita. I really appreciate it. I was talking with a friend the other day. We were just sitting down. I was telling her that I was having you on the podcast, and her eyes just got all wistful. She goes, "Oh, that Thread Bar workshop, that's one of my favorite workshops I ever took." And so it's just not me that you've impacted thousands and thousands of quilters, I'm sure.
That's because they didn't have any UFOs after that class.
But first, let's just go back, because you are also an amazing quilter. How did you come to quilting?
I came to quilting simply because I moved to Dundas from Toronto when I was expecting our third child. I knew no one. I was very despondent, and there was a little quilt store, a little fabric store in Dundas at the time, and they were offering quilting classes. I didn't drive, so of course my husband had to load up the machine in the car, and we went down to the class, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to meet all kinds of people. They're going to be my new best friends. I'm going to love it here. It's going to be fabulous. I don't have any idea who was in that class because we never became friends. I did start my first quilt, which was of course the ubiquitous log cabin, double polyester bat, quilt as you go. Can't kill that thing. It's been 32 years now. Polyester, one side, calico on the other half. Can't kill it, but that's what started me. And once I started that quilt, I just, you know how it is with quilting, you fall in love. It takes over your life.
Now, what part of quilting attracted you right from the beginning? Was it color? Was it the geometry? Was it?
It's fabrics. I think you either love fabrics or you're wishy-washy about them. I just love fabrics. I love the colors. I love the patterns. Yeah. I think also the methodical, the process, because I love every part of it.
And at what point did you slide into threads?
I had gone to an AQS show in Lancaster pretty early on, and I remember there was a vendor there who had, I think it was Star Thread that she sold by Coates, and her whole booth was just spools of thread. And I thought, oh my gosh, because nobody was paying attention to thread. Fabric was only starting to become very, quilt orientated, but nobody was paying attention to thread. And I thought, oh my gosh, why can't I get all this wonderful thread in Canada? And I thought, oh, I'm just going to sell it myself. And I decided to do that. It was the days before computers, so it was a lot of telephone work, trying to find out who wholesaled threads and various things like that. And my children were old enough. My husband stayed at home with the kids, and I thought, I'm just going to go to quilt shows on the weekend, set up a booth, and that's how I'm going to sell, because internet was just not around then. And that's how I did it. That's how I started.
So how long did you have your thread business?
24 years. I just retired in June. Yeah, so it was 24 years. Loved it. Just loved it.
I was talking to Melissa Marginette, who told me that she bought the last of your thread. She just took it all. She said, I'll have it all. Which is very nice for a business owner. But now I'm looking at my thread going, where am I buying this now? I used to get it from you at all the quilt shows. Or
a lot of it did move on to Kawartha Quilting and Sewing. They are online, so you can Google them, and they're selling a lot of the popular lines of Superior thread.
And how did you find the balance between running that business, running your family, and finding time for quilting? Did it cut into your quilting time? Did it make quilting all that much more easy, or?
At the beginning, it was very easy because I was just doing quilt shows every few weekends or so. It was easy enough. And it was fun because, of course, when your children are small, and I was home with the kids all the time. So the one thing I wanted to do was get away from the house. So having that avenue to go out to quilt shows, it perked me right up. It was fabulous. Once I started teaching, then it got really, really crazy. Then it was a very busy, hectic schedule.
That thread bar workshop, well, obviously it's impacted me. Obviously it's impacted so many people. How did you develop that? Was that something that, did you start from your own questions? Did you start from a format that other people were doing? It was so helpful. How did it happen?
I started doing a lot of research because thread just really interested me. The whole history of it, how it's made. I found that very, very fascinating. I love reading stuff like that. So I did a lot of research and I started taking notes and I thought, people don't know these things. I'm going to go to these guilds and I'm going to talk about thread. And that's what I started doing. And I also started looking at Superior Thread down in Utah. Bob Purcell, who was the founder and the owner at the time of Superior, was very focused on education. And I went down to one of his classes. At that time, he did like a 3-day sort of a workshop at Superior Threads in Utah. So I went down there, learned all I could. And I spoke to Bob and I said, I'm already selling thread in Canada. I'm already starting to do talks about thread. What more can I do? What else can I do? Let's sort of see where this goes. And Bob said, well, I can't be everywhere. I don't go up to Canada. It's too much travel. Why don't you teach on my behalf? Talk and teach on my behalf in Canada. The only proviso being that I only sell Superior Thread. So I thought, this sounds like fun. I can do this. So I got rid of all the Aurifil and the hand-dyed embroidery threads. Like I was selling all sorts of stuff at the time. It was a bit of a mishmash. And I focused just on selling the Superior Threads. And I started doing the thread talk, which of course I wrote up myself. Now the open thread bar was something that Cindy Needham, who's a very well-known quilter in the States, she's a machine quilter who works with old linens. She was doing the open thread bar for Superior in the US. So basically that sort of format, the idea of I brought all the threads for everybody to try out. What I did during the day, of course, that's a very personal thing, but basically that format was there for me to build upon. So I started offering that to guilds. And of course, you know what guilds are like. When there's a new speaker, a new program, everybody wants you. And then and I would just say, oh yeah, fine. And I would travel. I learned how to drive at the age of 40. And I thought, well, I can do this. I can travel around Ontario, no big deal. And I started traveling and it was actually crazy busy. And then it got to the point I couldn't do it by myself. And then my husband stepped in because he's self-employed. So he started coming with me. So it ended up being sort of a family business, really. But yeah, coast to coast. It was just a blast. I taught in Europe. Oh, it changed my life.
Well, I remember, must have been maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where you just said, bye everybody, I'm off to Western Canada. And you and your husband had packed up the trailer with the threads. And I guess you were hitting all the guilds as you went.
We were crazy
shows
people.
as you went across.
Oh, crazy. Oh, sure. We'd drive to Red Deer and guilds along the way would say, oh, would you come and teach in, wherever, Manitoba? Oh, sure. And now I think, oh my goodness. But at the time, I was a few years younger too.
Yes.
I had more pep. It's great. And the thing was too, we met people across the country, and no matter what certain styles were in certain areas, everybody had thread questions. Yeah. I taught in Latvia, which was so much fun. I knew quilters there, and I did I was there at the time just visiting. So I thought, well, I'll just do a little fun thing for them. And, a continent away, and same questions, same problems. So it was great.
So I put that couple of questions on the internet the other day.
Yeah.
On social media. What are your thread questions? And it is phenomenal how many questions are out there. What is the most common question that you're asked all the time, or the common group of questions that you're asked?
Well, I wrote down, I sort of looked at all those. I mean, they were great questions. I thought I shouldn't have retired because they still need to know all this stuff.
Yes, they do.
First of all, people need to know about weight, or they want to know about weight. They're very confused about thread weight. And basically, I would just say to simplify matters, because you can get very complicated and then you get all flustered and you can't remember. But I would just say that simply weight is a way of measuring the diameter of a thread. And there are different types of measurements. So you might see weight, you might see text. Forget all that. Just remember that a 50 weight thread, and that's the most popular way of measuring thread, a 50 weight is what we're piecing with. You can quilt with it also, but when you're piecing, you're using a 50 weight thread. When the number gets higher, the thread gets finer. So if you've got a 70 weight, an 80 weight, 100 weight, very fine threads. And when your number is lower, 30 weight, 40 weight, 12 weight, your threads are getting fatter. But 50s are piecing.
Sometimes it feels like that sizing is like women's clothing, like somebody's 50 is another person's 40. Like I find my Gutermann thread very thick compared to my Aurifil 50 thread.
Aurifil also, you need to know about Aurifil, it's a 50 weight 2-ply. So sometimes on a spool you might see 50/2, 50/3. That second number is the number of plies. And Aurifil 50 weight is a 2-ply thread. For instance, Masterpiece, which is the superior cotton, is a 50 weight 2-ply now. Some threads are 50 weight 3-ply. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. 50 weight 3-ply is the superior now. So it will be slightly heavier because there's just one extra ply of that thread. So that's why you will find Aurifil very fine, because of the ply.
Now, again, my immediately I ask, is it better to have 2-ply or is it better to have 3-ply, or it doesn't make a difference?
Your quality is the most important thing. I think that's sort of really 50 weight 2-ply, 50 weight 3-ply is not a big deal, but I think the quality of the thread is the most important thing. I always tell new quilters, or old quilters too, buy the best thread that you can afford. You're spending so much time on your project. You're buying fabrics, and they're $20 a meter in Canada now. Thread is not the place to cheese out on. Yeah. Buy good thread.
Well, I noticed a number of people asked, why is thread so expensive? And it's always I always say buy it so it's there, because it's a background, it's a cost of making a quilt that you, there's no, well, there can be a bling factor, but it's just one of those things that you just got to bite the bullet, buy the, as you said, buy the good stuff. So it's not this hurdle to overcome on your next quilt. One thing that you taught me was to use in-between colors. That red, what is it, 482 or 480, is it 487? That beautiful rusty red.
I can't remember the number now. It's totally.
But I have used that advice a lot. When did you sort of figure that one out, that it's better to use one that can cover more color range than try and match up the color specifically?
I think it really got to me when I started looking at quilt shows. And back in the day, you'd see a lot of Civil War prints, for instance, Civil War type prints in the quilts. And this would happen mostly with people who took them to long armors. And I'm sure they said, do whatever. And the long armor would put on those very dark, pretty dark Civil War type fabrics, she would put white thread on there, or cream. And to me, it killed the quilt, because suddenly you have this very, very noticeable thread quilted on that dark fabric. I like to use weirdo colors, because weirdo colors to me are the best colors. If you can't name that color, if you can't say, well, that's blue, then it's probably a good blender, because it can be a lot of things. It can be blue, it can be gray, it can be green. Thread changes color depending on the fabric color. And also you can change your fabric color by using certain colors of thread. So you get into this whole color question, and I find it fascinating. For instance, a lot of quilters nowadays like to use a very white or off-white fabric in their work, and then they'll have very colorful prints. So now when you go to quilt it, you've got white and you've got colors. If you chose a white thread, it's going to totally disappear in your white fabric. You're not really going to see the quilting. And once that white thread hits your vibrant colors, it's going to be white. It's really going to show up. So that's not really balanced to me. So what I would choose is some sort of, I'm not a pastel girl, but I have to say I'm really big on pastel colored threads. A pastel colored thread is going to disappear on your white fabric, believe it or not. It will show up just enough so that you can appreciate the quilting line. And yet once you hit those vibrant colors, a pastel is going to be softer than a white thread. So it's not going to scream at you. So that thread is now going to look much more balanced across your whole project. I think that's the biggest problem quilters have is, oh, my quilt is navy and white. What should I quilt it in, the navy thread or the white thread? And I say neither. Choose a color that's going to be sort of in the middle of all that.
Right. Great advice. I've used it a lot, and it's amazing the beautiful. Well, one, I'm always shocked at how it can disappear. You know, I chose this really bright yellow and I put it on my whites and you can barely see it. But how it brings out the color in the blues and the greens and the reds that it goes on top of, or something like that. That was really good advice that you gave me.
And the other thing to consider too, when you're choosing the thread for your quilting, you can quilt with anything. Quilters quite often think, what thread should I quilt with? Thinking that there's only one type of thread that you should be using. You can quilt with everything. Every thread type, every thread weight will give you a different look. So if you want your quilting to disappear, for instance, use a very fine weight thread. You can quilt with a 100 weight or an 80 weight thread. Your quilting is going to disappear. It's not going to be the focus of that quilt. If you want your quilting to really stand out, for instance, you can use a 40 weight thread in your machine, a heavier weight thread. You can even use a 12 weight thread in your machine if you really want that quilting line to be strong. So your weight of the thread also makes a huge difference. Anybody doing stitch in the ditch, there's only one thread you should be using, and that is the fine weight 100 weight or 80 weight thread. If you quilt with your regular 50 weight piecing thread, your stitch in the ditch is going to be visible. And to me, that takes away from the stitch in the ditch should be invisible. And unless you're using invisible thread, you should really stitch with a very, very fine weight thread, because that's the sort of quilting you don't want to see.
Right. Well, my concern when you get to 100 is it's strong enough.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. I stitch in the ditch. I've done that for years now with 100 weight by Superior. Absolutely. Yeah. And also if you're doing stippling or very heavy pebbling, if you're doing very tight designs, you again want a very fine weight thread, because you have to think of the proportion of the thread weight to the actual design. If your design is huge and open, you can use a heavier weight thread. But once you've got tiny, tiny stitching, if you do that stitching with a heavy weight thread, it's going to stitch on top of each other almost. It's going to be too packed in with thread.
So are we changing our needle when we're going down to that size as well?
Absolutely. You have to use the right needle with the corresponding thread. That's one thing. I think a lot of people have problems. Tension and needles, those are big issues. So with needles, definitely. I've started years and years ago, I started using one style of needle, and that is a top stitch needle. And that's the only type of needle I use for everything. Piecing, applique, quilting. And I've got my little, it's not little, I've got my needle right here to show you. And this is, you saw this in class. This is something Bob Purcell gave me one year to help me teach. Basically, I think a lot of people don't know enough about needles because they look at needle size, your 60, 70, 80, 90. They look at the size. They don't consider the style of needle. So when you look at a needle, you've got your point, you've got the eye of the needle, you've got along the shaft, you've got a groove that runs along the length of the shaft. Every component of that needle has been designed differently. So if you're buying a quilting needle, it's going to be designed differently than a microtex needle. And you think they're little differences, but they do make large differences in our sewing. The reason that I use a top stitch needle is it has a very deep groove, and that groove has a job. It actually protects the thread. So when your needle is in the machine, it protects the thread on its way down to the eye of the needle. The top stitch needle also has a very large eye, and that is quite often the problem with quilting or any sort of sewing. The thread is shredding. Your eye is not large enough, so that if your eye is not large enough, the thread cannot go through the eye properly. It gets stuck and it starts shredding back on itself. So a top stitch needle has a nice large eye that really accommodates the threads.
Now, is top stitch different from a quilting needle?
Quilting needle is designed differently. Every style is different. So your quilting needle actually has a small eye. It doesn't have a very large eye. It's a finer needle. The top stitch needle is a nice sturdy needle. It doesn't, I would say it breaks less than a finer needle. For instance, a microtex it's more bendy. A top stitch is not as bendy. It's also a sharp point, so that when we're piercing all those layers, especially once we get to the quilting part of it, if you're quilting on your machine, it really pierces all your layers nicely, because the hole that goes through all your layers of quilt has to be large enough to accommodate the thread. If that hole isn't large enough, the thread will shred. It can't travel through that hole and form a stitch.
Okay, that's a lot of
good, I know, I'm sorry,
review.
That's too much.
No. It's excellent information. I'm really glad we went over it again.
And that's why I keep it very simple, because you can have a whole slew of different types of needles and sizes. And again, you get flustered, you get confused. So I keep my life simple. I have a top stitch style of needle, and I have it in all the different sizes. I have 70, 80, 90. I don't use hundreds too often. So I can use any type of thread. I just need one style of needle in 3 different sizes. I use my size 60/10. 60 is the European sizing, the metric sizing. And the second number is simply an American number that's arbitrarily assigned. So a size 60 needle is a small, fine needle. If you have a fine thread, that matches up nicely. A 70 also can take like a fine thread, like a 50 weight thread that we piece with, usually will work nicely with your 70 needle. And if you're using heavier weight threads, like a 40 weight thread, I would bump up my needle size up to a 90 needle. Yeah. So, oh, sorry, I said 70, 80, and 90.
70, 80,
90. Yeah, those are my 3. 60 is very, very small. I don't really use it very often.
And where do you get these top stitch needles? Because I don't, like,
every company makes them. The ones I have, of course, they're the ones by Superior.
Right.
They're organ needles, made by Organ Needles in Japan, but Superior puts their brand name on it. I think most companies do sell top stitch needles.
Great. Okay, so I'll put a link for anybody watching. I'll put a link down in the notes to Superior Threads, just so if you're interested in getting that top stitch, I know I will be.
And it's not to say that other needles are bad. I mean, other needles are fabulous, but for my purposes, it just makes it very, very simple instead of having 20 different styles of needles in all kinds of different sizes. I mean, I've got enough clutter, you know.
Well, one thing that you made us do in the thread bar was you made us sew with different needles. And we have a bank we walked away with a book of the difference, visibly seeing the difference between this needle, that needle with the very same thread, doing the line of stitching, doing a zigzag, doing all sorts of different things. And I guess maybe I'll do a video in the future on how to set up your own little book, but I still refer to my book all the time. So,
and I think also quilters should not be afraid of bumping up the needle size. If the needle size that you're using, for instance, I can tell you that, oh, a 50 weight thread will work fine with your size 80/12 needle. I mean, and that's pretty standard. But maybe you've got different batting, or maybe your fabric is more tightly woven, for instance, a batik, right? So suddenly it's going to react differently to that size 80 needle. If it's not stitching out properly, who says you can't use a 90? Put in your size 90, a larger needle, and see if that solves the problem, because quite often just bumping up the needle size solves the problem. So don't be afraid of that. Nothing's written in stone.
Right. So if somebody's having problems with a stitch, they're running a line and the tension's not straight, what is the order that you should try to fix it? Like, do you do your tension first? Do you do your needle first? Do you change your thread? Which one would you do first?
What I like to do before I run into problems is I like to test everything out first.
Yes,
before I get to the
actual
before I get to the actual project.
Yeah.
It all depends. Usually I do look at tension. I think that quite often when people buy sewing machines and they're looking at all the bells and whistles and they say, oh, automatic tension. Oh, phew, I'll never have to adjust tension in my life. Bad news. Yes, you do. What automatic tension does is it chooses a thread tension for you based on not the thread that you've got in that machine, but it's simply based on the stitch that you've chosen. So if you've got an auto thread machine, if you've got a computerized screen, switch to your different stitches and you'll see every time you switch to a different stitch, from your straight to zigzag to a decorative, you're going to see your tension automatically changing on that screen. It has no idea what thread you put in that machine. So we do have to learn how to adjust tension. And it's very, very simple. And basically the rule is if your stitches are pulling through, if your top stitches are pulling through to the back, it means that your top thread tension is too loose. So if you think of tension as a tug of war between your top thread and your bobbin thread, if it's too loose on the top, that thread gets pulled to the back and you get loops. You need to tighten it. So you're going up to a higher number. And you can do that on any machine, whether it's auto tension or your old featherweight. Every machine has adjustable tension on it. Conversely, if your bobbin thread now is pulling up to the top, then you have to look at your top thread tension again. But now you realize that that tension is too tight. It's so strong on top, it's pulling up that bobbin thread and you're going to see little bits of bobbin thread. So you have to relax that tension, turn it down, go to a lower number until it stops doing that. And that's the tension that you need for that particular project. We are in Southern Ontario, so you know we've had some really crazy humid weather. Humidity can change your whole tension issue. You can have beautiful tension one day and the next day is a humid day and suddenly your tension is right off. Humidity in the air can affect your tension, your batting, your type of fabric. It can all affect your tension. So it's a good thing to learn how to change.
So what are the signs that you need to change your needle?
Your needle, I like to listen. Two schools of thought. Sometimes you'll read articles that say, oh, 8 hours of stitching and you should change a needle. What is 8 hours of sewing? I mean, we're getting up, we're getting a coffee, we're doing this, that, you know, we're not sitting for 8 solid hours. So are you really going to set a timer and figure out what is 8 hours? So that I don't think that's really very realistic. And some people will say, well, start a new project, put in a fresh needle. Then again, your needle might be just fine for that next project. So I like to listen to the sounds that my needle makes. And one of that sound that it makes is that sort of popping sound. You know, when you make a stitch and you hear it popping into the fabric, it's a very distinct sound. And it's one of those, you'll know it when you hear it situations. Basically, that's telling you that the needle tip is so dull, it can't pierce the fabric. It's pushing its way through. Time to change. If your stitches suddenly start skipping, that's a very good indicator that you probably have a burr on the needle or it's a dull needle. And burrs can sometimes, I've been quilting and needle was fine, and did it hit something underneath the machinery or whatever? Suddenly the stitches are skipping and I look and yes, there is a burr. You can just feel it. It's a bit sharp along the side of that needle. So time to replace the needle. And if you are machine quilting, if you notice that there are a lot of, if you turn your quilt over and there are a lot of little spots of white batting, that might also indicate that what the needle is doing is it's pushing through it. It's not sharp enough anymore to pierce. So it's pushing through and it is actually pushing through bits of batting as you're sewing. So those are sort of three things to look for as far as changing needles.
And when do you change your thread? Like I don't know whether I would have done it before I took your thread bar class, but I remember just being always kind of disappointed in the quality of my quilting. And then I changed threads after the quilt bar. And then I realized it wasn't me, it wasn't my machine, it was the thread.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because sometimes maybe you didn't choose really the best type of thread for that particular project, the color or the weight. Thread, you should be changing it all the time. Like, experiment. Do you want sheen on your project? Well, then you want a polyester that's a trilobal thread that has high sheen. Maybe you need really a very subtle matte finish. Cotton threads only have matte finishes. Polyesters also come with matte finishes. So I think by changing your threads, you can quilt with any thread out there. You can put anything in your machine except for hand quilting thread. Hand quilting thread has been waxed and starched and glazed, and those actually can come off in the mechanism of your machine. So hand quilting thread is for hand quilting. Everything else goes. It all depends on what you want your quilt to look like. And you don't need the same thread on the top as in the bobbin, because you know how to adjust tension now, right? Mm-hmm. So you can put any sort of combination. Maybe you want your back to look, oh, really blingy. So you'll put metallic in the top, but on the back, oh, I don't really want to see my pattern too much. Maybe I want something very fine. So you might put, let's say, an 80 weight or 100 weight or something very fine in the bobbin. Your threads don't have to match top and bottom. You can put whatever you want. I've had people putting glow-in-the-dark threads in the bobbin because they wanted the flip side of the quilt to glow in the dark. Sky's the limit. There's so much thread out there. It's so exciting. Don't stick to one thing.
I think it's Angela Walters that says, quilting is her therapy, but threads are her meds.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's absolutely true. Absolutely.
So one of the biggest questions I'm always asked about threads is polyester versus cotton. There's so many people that are 100% don't do polyester because it shreds or it melts or it does all these. And I think they're talking about threads from the 1960s. I remember you saying how far polyester threads have come.
Definitely. I don't even think it's a question. When I started with all these thread talks and classes, there was a lot of that. Oh my gosh, it's polyester. How can you use that? And in the last years, I didn't hear that. I think people have started opening their eyes a little bit and seeing what is out there. If you're buying good quality thread, it's good quality. Polyester thread will not cut the fibers of your cotton fabric. When you buy cotton clothing, even a simple $5 cotton t-shirt, do you think it's really put together with expensive cotton thread? It's sewn together with polyester. So I don't think that is an issue with polyester versus cotton. To me, it's not even a question anymore. As long as you're buying good quality thread. The other thing that people should be aware of when they're buying cotton thread is that, and I know some of the people on your Instagram were asking about lint. Cotton thread is always linty. And somebody else asked about the cost of thread. Why is it so expensive? So one thing with cotton, of course, cotton is not cheap. It's very expensive to produce cotton. There are 3 grades of cotton. There's an extra long staple cotton. And some companies, for instance, Superior, will actually write that on their spools of thread. Staple is simply a word for the length of fiber. So an extra long staple means that fiber is very long. So there's less lint. Cotton will always have lint, but if you're buying a premium extra long staple cotton, you're paying for it, it will have less lint. Then you'll have a long staple cotton, and those threads are pretty good. They will be slightly more linty, but they will be less in price. And then of course there's sort of the bottom of the rung, and those are the threads. They don't say anything about the staple that's there. You'll notice they're very linty. And you know, if a thread looks linty on the spool, chances are it's already going to be linty in your project. So you're paying for different grades of cotton. That's where the price comes in, and also the lint factor. If you're using polyester threads, there is no lint in polyester. If they're sometimes with the spun polyesters, there might be some lint. But for the extruded polyester threads, there's no lint. And that's the nice thing about using the polyesters. They're clean.
Another question. I've been given a bag of threads from somebody's grandmother or great aunt that just passed away, how do I know which ones are good to use? Like some of them are covered in dust, some of them look perfectly fine. Like, is there like, does thread have a life? Is a half-life or
I think the threads, when we're buying threads today, the threads that we have available to us are, for the most part, if you're buying good quality threads, they are high quality threads. Don't worry, they're going to outlast you and I. If you've got that stash, put it in your will, because you will be passing it on to somebody. I think the problem sometimes with old threads is, and when you say, oh, they're already covered in dust, you know what, if they're already covered in dust, when you put that thread on your machine, that dust is going to go where? It's going to go right into the thread path of your machine. Do you want that? Personally, I paid enough for my machine. I don't want that happening. So some of those old threads, you don't know how they've been stored. Have they faded? Is that outside of that spool a different color than when you get to the inside of that spool? Has that thread actually faded over time? Sometimes really old threads, you know, there's a chance that they may have dried out. And I noticed a few people were writing about, you know, dipping thread in mineral oil and all sorts of stuff. I know that Sharon Chamber, who's a long arm quilter of great renown and talent, wrote about that years and like 20 years ago. And I think nowadays, oh, really, I've never had to do that with thread. But if your thread, if you try that cotton thread that's really ancient and it really snaps easily, I don't know, maybe just put it all in a jar, you know, and just sort of keep it as a keepsake. But some of those old threads, really for $10 for a spool of thread, I don't think it's a big deal to buy a new spool of thread. Then you know, right? There's no doubt.
Just switching gears here just for a second, just switching gears. You are a phenomenal quilter on your own. When you did trunk shows, you had these beautiful, beautiful quilts in so many colors. Some of them were very modern. You did amazing things with calf shot cottons and things like that. I was looking through photographs the other day and I still have those pictures. How did you come up with your aesthetic? Did you just kind of fall into it? Did you make conscious choices as you were moving along? You definitely have a very distinctive color palette, which I personally like very much. Talk a little bit more about your journey as you become a better quilter.
I would say that I used to be a good quilter, and now I'm very, very mediocre as far as the actual quilting. I used to love the actual quilting part of it. I love machine quilting. I marked my quilts to death, but I did free motion quilting, but not freehand because I didn't have all the designs up in my brain to do that. So I did mark my quilts heavily. I did freehand quilting, and I loved the finicky sort of making each stitch even before stitch regulators. I love that. Then I had a very unfortunate few years with my heart, and I was put on a very toxic heart medication, and I woke up one morning in Europe and I couldn't see properly. I had lost a lot of my vision in one eye, and it was depth of field, depth of vision, field of vision. Things were just not normal anymore, and that sort of changed. That actually did change my whole quilting outlook, I guess. I came back home and I couldn't quilt anymore. Like I would piece stuff a little bit, but I just couldn't. I put it away. I couldn't quilt because, you know what? I couldn't quilt the way that I used to quilt, doing all these designs and, you know. So that really changed things for me. And then I stayed like that for a little while. And then I thought, who cares? I make bed quilts. You know, I don't do the stuff that I make is just because I love making it, and it's for my kids, for my family. I give quilts away to friends. So it's only quilting. It shouldn't be more than it actually is. And I thought, so if I just do straight lines for the rest of my life, really, who cares? And I got back into quilting again. And that was kind of nice, just sort of stopping to realize that life is always in flux. It's always change. You have to accept it. And just because you did something really great before, maybe now you can't do it the same way. So you have to adjust, and you have to be willing to do that. So I guess I just don't take quilting as seriously as I should. You know what? It's quilting. It's got to be fun, right? I always say it's only quilting. And even though it's important to me, it really is only quilting, right? So just have fun.
Well, the other day on your Instagram feed, I'll find it and I'll post it online when this goes live. That wonderful curve block that you
I
were
love
doing
that.
with the stripes in the middle. Like, are those conscious decisions that you're making, or did you just come up with that idea?
No, I can't come up with an original idea. Are you kidding me? No, I had made those curved blocks and I loved it because because seeing a 1/4 of an inch, like I have a Bernina, so it's got that flange that you put that your fabric butts up against it. So
Yeah.
I don't have to see the edge of my presser foot. So it's very easy for me to get that 1/4 inch, but I don't do finicky stuff because of my vision. So I started doing these curved blocks in a class that I had taken at the Ancaster Modern Guild with Susan Clark. And we just made a whole bunch of blocks and basically that was it for the day. But I started looking at them and they were so much fun because of course you have to trim them later. It doesn't matter what size they are because you trim it. That's my kind of work now. That's the only thing I want to do. So I had these blocks and I love the fabrics. Of course, there was the acidic green, yellow, citron color and the blues. And I thought, oh, I really love this. Now I'm going to work on it. So they were different sizes. And there's this book. I don't know if you're seeing it wrong sides. Okay. Yeah. So it's called Vivacious Curvy Quilts and it's by Diane Heyer. So it's not a new book because it's one of the oldies but goldies. And in it, I think she calls them not windmill blades or something like that. So they are those strips that you put in to bring your blocks up to a certain size, because some of my blocks were square, but some were rectangular. And of course I wanted them all to make a square at the end. So I had to put in those little coping strips, if you will. So that's where I got that idea. And I loved it. It was so much fun. So I really want to do more curved stuff because it's easy peasy.
Oh, it was inspiring. I'm like, oh, I need to get to my sewing machine and do this.
Yeah.
So have you passed on the love of quilting to any of your children or your grandchildren?
No, my 3 sons have all used the machine when they were really little and they made something, when they were tiny kids. My oldest grandson is 3 and he loves, when he comes to visit, he loves sitting on my lap and sewing something. So he will sit on my lap and we'll put some fabric through and he helps and then he'll run and show his mom and he loves doing that. Whether it goes somewhere, who knows? But the thing is you enjoy some time with them, sharing something that you love to do. And everybody loves quilts, right?
Yes.
So, all the kids have a gazillion quilts each, but they love them. They truly love them and they love getting them. So keeps me happy too.
Great. How has COVID changed your quilting?
I love it. I love it.
It's what we've all been training for, right?
I've absolutely been training for this. I think with those years of really traveling like crazy, and though it sounds so interesting, it's not interesting because what you're doing is you're sitting in a car endlessly. You're, setting up a booth somewhere in some hall, somewhere. I mean, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work to travel for quilting and for teaching. So once we had the stay in place, I thought, this is fabulous. I was so relaxed. I thought, I don't have to go anywhere. It's fabulous. So I have to say, from that viewpoint, I've enjoyed being at home. I can't drive anymore myself. So it's less driving for my husband. So he doesn't have to take me to all these places and venues. I've enjoyed the opportunities that we've had that we wouldn't have had life continued the way it was. I've taken classes with people who I would never have had the opportunity to take classes with. There are all kinds of interesting Zoom talks going on with, I think I'm going to something from the Art Museum of San Diego this weekend. Like, I would never be there taking a lecture, right? So I think we have to look at all the fabulous opportunities that we've been given. As you know, I've got Parkinson's now, and I was diagnosed with that in December. And by March, I had found a boxing group fairly local to me boxing is one of the prime exercises for Parkinson's, because it's basically exercise slows down the progression of this neurological degenerative disease. So I started boxing. Third week in, COVID, and I thought, oh, what am I going to do now? Everything went on Zoom. My yoga went on Zoom. My boxing went on Zoom. My Parkinson's support group went on Zoom. Parkinson's boxing, because I exercise like all the time now. So all those groups went on Zoom. I go to my living room in my leggings and I'm set for my class. I don't have to travel anywhere. And I've had all the support of all these groups during this time. So I've done more staying at home than I probably would have if I had to go physically to every last thing, right? So I'm okay.
How's your UFO pile? Have you been able to dig in and get some done?
A little bit, yeah, a little bit. And I don't worry. Sometimes I worry and I think, oh my gosh, I'm going to die and all this stuff is left. And I think, you know, you can't worry about it. I shouldn't have made it if I was going to worry about it, right? So I have dug into it a little bit, and I'm a little more mindful of just finishing off a few things before I know we're always starting something, but I'm actually finishing a whole bunch of things, which is nice.
So do you have any projects on the go that you're looking forward to for 2020 or 2021? Or are you just enjoying all your retirement as it comes?
Quilting projects or projects of life, or
well, it's very hard to
plans.
plan now, right? With COVID, you don't know whether you're going to be able to travel. So we're readjusting. I find, especially myself, I'm readjusting plans. Is your family close? Do you?
I have a son in Kitchener, one in Calgary, one in Toronto. So the Calgary one, they have a 2-year-old, and I'm really missing him. So we had plans, of course, this year. No, that's one thing that Parkinson's has taught me, is that you really can't plan, because I don't know what's going to happen with me. I don't know what I'm going to be like next year. I don't know what I'm going to be like 2 years down the road. When I was teaching and traveling for quilt shows and that, I had my whole year booked in my calendar. I knew every day where I was going to be for the next year. Now I just put one step in front of another, right? Because I don't know what's going to happen. So I really just have to do what I'm doing now and enjoy what I can. And what's going to happen is going to happen, right?
So if people want to follow you on Instagram, what is your Instagram handle?
I've changed it from my business account. I've changed it to my personal name, which is Anita Zobens. And that's my Instagram. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. We haven't talked about
such an amazing woman.
Oh, we haven't talked about half the stuff I wanted to talk about.
Well, maybe I should bring you back then.
But I think that's probably a place for people to start with. I think the basic thing I would like people to take away is that they shouldn't be afraid. It's not overwhelming. It's only thread. It's only sewing. Make a test. If that doesn't work, try another needle, another type of thread. Don't get caught up in, you know, it's not the end of the world. But don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to experiment with your machine and with the different threads that are out there, for sure.
Great. Again, thank you so much. And I hope you'll come back and be on the show again.
Love to. Thank you so much, Karen. It's been a joy.
Great. Thank you.
Wasn't Anita wonderful? She is such a delightful woman to be around. Her energy is infectious. If you want to learn more about Anita, I am going to put her social media contacts in the link below. She has absolutely stunning quilts on her Instagram feed, so check it out. The Vivacious Curvy Quilts book that she referenced, unfortunately, is out of print, but you can still buy it on Amazon resellers, and I'll put that link in the notes below too. So I hope you come back for our next one. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you know when the next interview goes live. In October, I'm going to have Peter Byrne of Hover Quilting. He won the grand prize at QuiltCon 2020. And Bobby Gentili of Geeky Bobbin. She is a pattern designer. She is a long armer and she is an Instagrammer extraordinaire. And if by chance you know any other special quilters that you think I should interview, please send me an email with their contact information at info@justgetitdonequilts.com. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell beside the subscribe button so YouTube will notify you when I make new videos. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Just Get It Done Quilts. And of course, subscribe to my newsletter at justgetitdonequilts.com. So take care, and I'll see you next time.